The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy city streets as Dr. Sarah Mitchell checked her watch for the third time. It was 6:45 a.m., and she was right on schedule. Her black Tesla smoothly pulled into the private aviation terminal's parking lot, its wheels crunching softly on the perfectly maintained asphalt. Dr. Mitchell had spent the last 15 years building her career as a neurosurgeon, and every minute of hard work showed in her confident stride. She was wearing a neat navy blue pantsuit, her natural hair styled professionally, and carrying both her medical bag and a small overnight suitcase. The early morning staff nodded respectfully as she passed. Many of them knew her from previous flights. This wasn't her first emergency call, but it was perhaps the most critical. A young patient in Denver needed immediate surgery for a rare brain condition, and Dr. Mitchell was one of the few surgeons in the country qualified to perform the complex procedure. The hospital had arranged a private jet to fly her in, knowing that every minute counted. As she walked through the terminal's automatic glass doors, Dr. Mitchell reflected on her journey. Growing up in a middle-class family in Detroit, she had always dreamed big. Her parents, her father a high school teacher and her mother a nurse, had instilled in her the value of education and perseverance. They had supported her through medical school, celebrated her residency completion, and cheered when she became the youngest head of neurosurgery at Boston General Hospital. The clicking of her sensible heels echoed through the quiet terminal as she approached the check-in counter. Sandra, the morning receptionist, brightened at the sight of her. "Good morning, Dr. Mitchell. Your flight is ready and waiting. The weather in Denver is clear, so you should have a smooth journey." Dr. Mitchell smiled warmly. "Thanks, Sandra. Any word from Denver General about the patient's condition?" "They sent an update 10 minutes ago. The patient is stable, but they're eager for your arrival. The pilot has already filed the flight plan, and you should be there in about 3.5 hours. Opening her leather briefcase, Dr. Mitchell pulled out the patient's files she had reviewed the night before. Young Thomas Parker, just 12 years old, had been diagnosed with a rare arteriovenous malformation, a complex tangle of abnormal blood vessels in his brain. The condition was like a ticking time bomb, and standard procedures weren't an option due to the location of the malformation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Williams, the resident physician handling Thomas's case in Denver. "Patient stable. Family anxious but hopeful. Operating room being prepped. Safe flight, Dr. M." As she typed a quick response, Dr. Mitchell noticed several other passengers in the terminal watching her with interest. She was used to it by now. Being one of the few black women in her field meant she often stood out. But over the years, she had learned to let her work speak for itself. Her success rate with complex neurological cases was among the highest in the country, and her research had been published in leading medical journals. The terminal's coffee shop was just opening, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Dr. Mitchell checked her watch again. She had time for a quick espresso before boarding. As she waited in line, she overheard two businessmen discussing their morning flight to Chicago. One of them suddenly turned and did a double take. "Excuse me," he said, "but aren't you Dr. Mitchell, the one who performed that groundbreaking surgery last month? My wife is a medical researcher, and she can't stop talking about your innovative approach to reducing post-operative complications." Dr. Mitchell nodded politely, used to such recognition within medical circles. "Yes, that's me. The technique is still being refined, but the initial results are promising." After getting her coffee, she walked toward the security checkpoint, her mind already focused on the surgery ahead. She had reviewed the 3D scans of Thomas's brain multiple times, planning each precise move she would need to make. These were the moments she lived for, when her skills could make the difference between life and death. The morning sun streamed through the terminal's high windows, creating patterns on the polished floor. Dr. Mitchell felt ready, focused, and confident. In just a few hours, she would be in an operating room in Denver, doing what she did best, saving lives. Little did she know that before she could board her flight, she would face a challenge that had nothing to do with medical expertise and everything to do with something she had dealt with her entire life: prejudice. As Dr. Mitchell approached the security checkpoint, she noticed a new guard she hadn't seen before. James Reynolds stood with his feet planted wide, hands on his belt, watching her with narrowed eyes. Unlike the other staff who smiled or nodded in recognition, his face remained hard and unwelcoming. "ID and boarding documents," Reynolds barked before she even reached the checkpoint. His tone made several nearby passengers turn their heads. Dr. Mitchell calmly pulled out her identification and flight documentation. She had done this hundreds of times before. "Good morning," she said professionally, holding out the papers. "I'm Dr. Mitchell. I have a charter flight to Denver for an emergency surgery." Reynolds barely glanced at the documents. "This is the private aviation terminal," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "Are you sure you're in the right place? The regular terminal is down the road." "Yes, I'm quite sure," Dr. Mitchell replied, keeping her voice steady. "As you can see from my documentation, I'm the neurosurgeon expected on this flight. The hospital in Denver arranged it." Reynolds laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Right, and I'm the President of the United States." He turned to his colleague, another security guard who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Can you believe this? She's trying to tell me she's some kind of brain surgeon." The other guard, whose name tag read Martinez, shifted uneasily. "James, maybe we should." No, Reynolds cut him off. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know when something's not right." He turned back to Dr. Mitchell. "Listen, lady, I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but—" "Excuse me," Dr. Mitchell interrupted firmly, her patience wearing thin as precious minutes ticked by. "My credentials are in order. You can call the charter company, the hospital, or my office for verification. A 12-year-old boy is waiting for emergency surgery, and every minute of delay puts his life at greater risk." Reynolds' face reddened. "Are you telling me I have to do my job?" His voice rose, drawing even more attention. "I said this is the private terminal. We get a lot of important people through here. CEOs, celebrities, real doctors. Now, I'm going to need you to leave before I call for backup." Dr. Mitchell felt her heart racing, but years of performing delicate surgery under pressure had taught her to stay calm in stressful situations. She pulled out her phone. "Let me call the charter company myself." "Put the phone down," Reynolds shouted, his hand moving to his radio. "That could be a weapon." Several gasps came from the growing crowd of onlookers. Sandra, the receptionist who had greeted Dr. Mitchell earlier, was already on the phone, speaking urgently to someone. Just then, a voice cut through the tension. "Dr. Mitchell? Sarah Mitchell?" A tall man in a pilot's uniform was walking quickly toward them. "I thought it was you. I attended your lecture at the Medical Aviation Conference last month. That presentation on in-flight medical emergencies was brilliant." Reynolds' expression flickered with uncertainty for the first time. The pilot, Captain David Chen, turned to him with a frown. "Is there a problem here? Dr. Mitchell is one of the top neurosurgeons in the country." "She claims she has a private flight," Reynolds muttered, less confident now. "Of course she does," Captain Chen said firmly. "Half the medical community knows about this emergency case in Denver. It's been all over our flight planning channels." More people were gathering now. A woman in a business suit was recording the scene on her phone. Martinez, the other security guard, had stepped away and was speaking rapidly into his radio. Through the terminal windows, Dr. Mitchell could see a black SUV pulling up outside. Sandra hurried over with her phone outstretched. "Sir, the terminal manager would like to speak with you," she said to Reynolds, her voice clipped and professional but her eyes angry. Reynolds stared at the phone like it might bite him. His face had gone from red to pale. The crowd around them had grown larger, and whispers of discrimination and lawsuit could be heard. Dr. Mitchell checked her watch again, her thoughts returning to young Thomas waiting in Denver. This delay could cost precious minutes in a situation where every second counted. She took a deep breath, straightened her spine, and prepared to handle this situation just as she handled difficult surgeries, with precision, professionalism, and unwavering focus on what needed to be done. The tension in the private terminal was thick enough to cut with a knife. As Reynolds stood there holding Sandra's phone, unwilling to speak with the terminal manager, more people began stepping forward to support Dr. Mitchell. A well-dressed woman pushed through the crowd, her heels clicking purposefully on the floor. "I know Dr. Mitchell," she announced clearly. "My husband was her patient last year, a brain tumor that other doctors said was inoperable. She saved his life." The woman, Mrs. Rebecca Chen, turned to Dr. Mitchell with a warm smile. "I'd recognize you anywhere, doctor. You gave us our life back." Captain David Chen, still standing nearby, pulled up Dr. Mitchell's medical lecture on his tablet. "Look," he said, turning the screen toward Reynolds. Here she is giving the keynote speech at last month's conference. The same woman you're trying to turn away. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, but still didn't move from his position blocking the security checkpoint. 2 more security guards had arrived, but they stayed back, assessing the situation with concerned looks. A young man in an airline uniform stepped forward next. "I have to speak up," he said, his voice shaking slightly but determined. "I've been working this terminal for 6 months, and I've seen Mr. Reynolds do this before. He always gives extra scrutiny to certain passengers, if you know what I mean." The young man, whose name tag read Tyler, looked nervous but stood his ground. Sandra, the receptionist, was now openly glaring at Reynolds. "The charter company is on another line," she announced loudly. "They're confirming that Dr. Mitchell is their scheduled passenger, and they're demanding to know why their flight is being delayed." Through the terminal windows, more vehicles were arriving. A black SUV with airport administration on its side had parked, and 2 officials in suits were hurrying toward the entrance. Dr. Mitchell's phone buzzed again, another message from Denver. She looked at it and felt her heart sink. "The patient's condition is deteriorating," she said quietly, but in the tense silence, everyone heard her. "He needs surgery within the next 4 hours." This announcement caused a stir in the crowd. A teenage girl near the front pulled out her phone and started typing rapidly. "I'm tweeting this," she declared. "My mom's a surgeon too, and this is not okay." Mrs. Chen stepped closer to Dr. Mitchell, placing a supportive hand on her arm. "What can we do to help?" she asked. Other voices joined in, offering to call hospital administrators, aviation authorities, even local news stations. Just then, the charter company's representative burst through the terminal doors. Mark Thompson, a man in his 50s wearing a pilot's uniform with executive stripes, looked furious. "What in the world is going on here?" he demanded. "We have a medical emergency flight waiting, and our surgeon is being detained." Reynolds finally seemed to realize the gravity of his situation. His face had gone from pale to almost gray, and sweat was visible on his forehead. The phone in his hand was still ringing with the terminal manager's call. "Sir," Martinez, the other security guard, finally spoke up. "I think we need to let Dr. Mitchell through. All her credentials are in order, and we have multiple witnesses confirming her identity." A woman in a business suit who had been quietly recording everything cleared her throat. "I'm an attorney," she said calmly, "and I want everyone to know I've documented this entire incident. Dr. Mitchell, if you need this footage later, I'll be happy to provide it." The airport administrators had reached the scene now, and the crowd parted to let them through. The older of the 2, a woman with silver hair and a commanding presence, took one look at the situation and turned to Reynolds. "Step aside," she ordered. "Now." As Reynolds finally moved away from the checkpoint, the crowd broke into spontaneous applause. Captain Chen quickly stepped forward to escort Dr. Mitchell through security. Mrs. Chen and several others followed, forming a protective group around her. "I'll personally escort you to your aircraft, Doctor," Captain Chen said firmly. "And I'll make sure the flight plan is expedited to make up for lost time." As they walked toward the private jet area, Dr. Mitchell felt overwhelmed by the support of these strangers who had become unexpected allies. Behind them, she could hear the airport administrator beginning what sounded like a very serious conversation with Reynolds. But her mind was already shifting to her patient in Denver and the delicate surgery that awaited her. Thanks to these allies, she would still be able to make it in time. As Dr. Mitchell walked quickly toward her waiting flight, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a video call from Denver General Hospital. She stopped at the terminal's large windows, the private jet visible in the distance, and answered the call. Dr. Williams's worried face appeared on the screen. Behind him, nurses moved quickly through the hospital corridor. "Dr. Mitchell, we have a situation," he said, his voice tense. "Thomas' latest scan shows increased pressure in his brain. His parents are getting very worried." Dr. Mitchell's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "Put me on with his parents, right now." She knew that every minute counted, but these parents needed reassurance from their son's surgeon. The screen shifted, and she saw the faces of Robert and Mary Parker, their eyes red from crying. 12-year-old Thomas was their only child, and they had already lost too much sleep over his condition. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," Dr. Mitchell said softly but firmly, "I want you to know that I'm on my way. We've had a small delay at the airport, but I will be there in time. Thomas is in good hands with Dr. Williams until I arrive. Mary Parker wiped her eyes. But what if? No what ifs, Dr. Mitchell interrupted gently. I've done this surgery 16 times before. Your son will be number 17, and I plan to make it just as successful as the others. Behind her, Captain Chen was speaking urgently into his radio, trying to arrange for priority takeoff clearance. The attorney who had recorded the incident was making calls of her own, her voice carrying words like discrimination and emergency medical flight. Dr. Mitchell continued speaking to the parents. Thomas's type of arteriovenous malformation is complex, but it's not impossible to treat. Remember what we discussed. The blood vessels are like a tangled garden hose, and I'm going to carefully untangle them. This simple explanation, one she had used in their first meeting, seemed to calm the parents slightly. Robert Parker nodded, holding his wife's hand tighter. The operating room is ready, Dr. Williams added, coming back into view. We prepared everything according to your specifications, Dr. Mitchell. The surgical team will be standing by. Just then, Sandra ran up with an update. Doctor, they've cleared all other aircraft. Your flight has priority takeoff. The pilot says you can be in Denver in 3 hours and 15 minutes. Dr. Mitchell quickly calculated the timing in her head. If they took off in the next 15 minutes, and with the hospital being just 20 minutes from Denver's airport, she could be scrubbed in and ready to operate within 4 hours. It would be cutting it close, but it was doable. The attorney stepped forward, handing Dr. Mitchell her business card. I contacted our firm's Denver office, she said. They'll have a car waiting at the airport. No more delays. On the phone screen, young Thomas's latest brain scans appeared as Dr. Williams shared them. Dr. Mitchell studied them intently, her trained eyes noting every detail. The tangled blood vessels were precarious, but she had seen worse. She could fix this. She would fix this. Start the pre-surgical procedures, she instructed Dr. Williams. I want him ready the moment I arrive. As she ended the call, Mrs. Chen appeared with a coffee cup. It's hot and strong, she said. You'll need it. The woman's kindness, after all the morning's tension, almost brought tears to Dr. Mitchell's eyes. But there wasn't time for emotion now. A young boy's life waited in the balance. The airport administrator who had ordered Reynolds to stand down approached with purpose. Dr. Mitchell, we sincerely apologize for this morning's incident. A security escort will take you directly to your aircraft. Is there anything else you need? Dr. Mitchell shook her head, already moving toward the exit. Captain Chen and Mrs. Chen flanked her like protective guards. Behind them, she could hear the administrator speaking into her phone about immediate suspension and full investigation, but those were problems for another day. As they stepped out onto the tarmac, the morning sun now high in the sky, Dr. Mitchell's mind was already in the operating room. She reviewed the surgical steps in her head, picturing each movement, each delicate maneuver she would need to perform. The sound of the jet's engine starting up filled the air with promise. We'll make up the lost time in the air, the pilot assured her as she climbed aboard. Weather conditions are perfect for a fast flight. Dr. Mitchell nodded, buckling in as the cabin crew secured the door. In just over 3 hours, she would be doing what she did best, saving lives. The morning's confrontation had been frustrating and infuriating, but she couldn't let it distract her from what really mattered. A 12-year-old boy who needed her help. Back in the terminal, Airport Director Patricia Morrison was not having a good morning. As she watched Dr. Mitchell's plane take off through the large terminal windows, her face was set in a grim expression. Beside her, Head of Security John Baker was reviewing the security camera footage on his tablet. This is unacceptable, Morrison said, her voice controlled but angry. That boy in Denver could have. She stopped herself, took a deep breath, and turned to face Reynolds, who stood nervously between two senior security officers. Reynolds had lost all his earlier swagger. His security badge had already been taken, and his uniform looked wrinkled from nervous sweating. The crowd of witnesses had thinned, but those who remained were still recording everything on their phones. Mr. Reynolds, Morrison began, her gray hair catching the morning sunlight. In my 30 years at this airport, I had never seen such a blatant display of unprofessional behavior. Do you understand that your actions today could have cost a child his life? Before Reynolds could answer, Sandra the receptionist stepped forward with a thick folder. Director Morrison, I have the incident reports you requested, including 3 similar complaints about Mr. Reynolds from the past month alone. The color drained from Reynolds' face. He hadn't known about the documented complaints. The young airline employee, Tyler, had also stayed to give his statement about witnessing previous incidents of discrimination. Ma'am, Reynolds started, his voice shaky. I was just trying to maintain security. Security? John Baker cut in, his deep voice filled with disappointment. I reviewed your body camera footage. Dr. Mitchell presented proper identification, multiple forms of documentation, and had several people vouching for her identity. You ignored all of this. Why? The question hung in the air. Reynolds looked at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The attorney who had recorded everything was still present, quietly taking notes on her phone. Morrison turned to her assistant. Call an emergency meeting of the airport board. I want every security protocol reviewed by this afternoon. She looked at the attorney. And we'll need your recorded evidence if you're willing to share it. The attorney, Lisa Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen from earlier, nodded. Of course. And I should inform you that my firm is already receiving calls from civil rights organizations about this incident. Just then, a group of reporters gathered outside the terminal's glass doors, their cameras visible. Word had gotten out fast. Morrison straightened her jacket and gestured to her PR director to handle the media. Mr. Reynolds, she said, turning back to the disgraced guard, you are immediately suspended pending a full investigation. Please surrender your remaining equipment to Mr. Baker. As Reynolds was escorted out through a side door, Morrison gathered her senior staff. I want every security member in this terminal to undergo immediate retraining. Contact the diversity and inclusion firm we worked with last year. We need them back. And I want personal apology letters sent to Dr. Mitchell and Denver General Hospital. The terminal was buzzing with activity now. Staff members who had witnessed the incident were giving statements. Security protocols were being reviewed on computer screens. Training schedules were being reorganized. Sandra approached Director Morrison with another update. Dr. Mitchell's plane has reached cruising altitude. They're estimating arrival in Denver in just over 3 hours. Morrison nodded, relieved that at least the doctor was on her way, but she knew this incident would have lasting repercussions for the airport. Already, her phone was filling with messages from board members, city officials, and civil rights leaders. Get me the numbers for our diversity training budget, she told her assistant. And contact HR. We're going to need to make some significant changes to our hiring and screening processes. The morning sun now filled the terminal completely, highlighting the activity within. Security cameras that had captured the whole incident continued to record as new procedures were already being put in place. Signs about reporting discrimination were being posted at every checkpoint. Lisa Chen, the attorney, approached Morrison one last time. You should know that this incident will likely become a case study in how airports handle discrimination. Your response today will be crucial. Morrison looked at the bustling terminal, at her staff working to fix what had gone wrong. Then let's make sure we set the right example, she said firmly. This ends today. As the morning continued, the incident with Dr. Mitchell had sparked a chain reaction of changes that would reshape the airport's entire security culture. Sometimes it took a crisis to force necessary change, and Morrison was determined to make that change count. While Dr. Mitchell's plane soared towards Denver, the videos of her confrontation with Reynolds spread across social media like wildfire. The teenage girl who had first tweeted about the incident had tagged several major news organizations, and her post was already going viral. Hashtag Dr. Wildblack was trending within hours. The clips showed everything. Reynolds' hostile behavior, Dr. Mitchell's professional composure, and the crowd of supporters who stood up for her. Each new share brought more outrage and calls for change. In the hospital break room in Denver, nurses and doctors gathered around their phones, watching the videos in disbelief. That's our surgeon, one nurse asked, shaking her head. The one coming for Thomas Parker? Dr. Williams, who had been updating the Parker family, saw his own phone filling with notifications. Colleagues from across the country were messaging him about the incident. Many offered to help if the surgery needed to be rescheduled, but Dr. Williams knew that wasn't an option. Thomas needed Dr. Mitchell, and he needed her today. Back at the airport, Sandra the receptionist noticed her phone buzzing constantly. The video she had secretly recorded from behind her desk had been shared thousands of times. News vans were now parked outside the terminal, and reporters were trying to interview anyone walking in or out. "Did you see this?" Tyler, the young airline employee, showed his phone to Sandra. A major news network had picked up the story. The headline read, "Renowned neurosurgeon racially profiled while rushing to save child's life." Social media influencers and celebrities began sharing the story. A famous basketball player tweeted, "I fly private all the time and never face this treatment. This has to stop. Prayers for the young patient waiting for Dr. Mitchell." A well-known medical TV show host posted a long thread about Dr. Mitchell's achievements. "This woman has saved countless lives. She's published groundbreaking research. She teaches other surgeons. And she was treated like a criminal because of her skin color. We must do better." In the plane, unaware of the social media storm, Dr. Mitchell was reviewing her surgical plans. The flight attendant, who had seen the trending videos, treated her with extra care, ensuring she had everything she needed to work comfortably. The attorney, Lisa Chen, was being interviewed live on a news channel. "What we witnessed today wasn't just one incident of discrimination. It was a systemic failure that nearly had tragic consequences. A child's life was put at risk because of one man's prejudice." Medical associations began releasing statements. The American Board of Neurological Surgery posted, "Dr. Sarah Mitchell represents the excellence we strive for in our field. The treatment she received today highlights the ongoing challenges faced by medical professionals of color." Comments flooded every post. "This happened to my sister last month at a different airport." "Dr. Mitchell operated on my mother last year. She's brilliant." How many talented doctors face this every day? The real question is, how many lives are put at risk by this kind of discrimination? Mrs. Chen, who had supported Dr. Mitchell at the terminal, shared her own video statement. "I watched this woman save my husband's life when no one else could. Today, I watched her face discrimination with the same grace and professionalism she shows in the operating room." Hospital administrators across the country began sharing their own policies about emergency medical transport. Denver General Hospital released a statement. "We are grateful to those who helped Dr. Mitchell overcome this obstacle to reach her patient. Every minute counts in emergency medicine." The Parker family, waiting anxiously at the hospital, was shocked to learn about what their son's surgeon had faced. "She's still coming to help our boy, even after all that," Mary Parker said through tears. "We need to thank everyone who helped her get here." Aviation forums lit up with discussions about discrimination in private terminals. Pilots shared stories of similar incidents they had witnessed. Charter companies promised to review their security protocols. Captain Chen, who had stood up for Dr. Mitchell, found his professional pilot forums buzzing with discussion. His colleagues were organizing a task force to address discrimination in private aviation. "We can't let this happen again," one senior pilot wrote. "We're supposed to help people reach their destinations, not block their way." By the time Dr. Mitchell's plane reached Denver airspace, her story had reached millions. The incident was no longer just about one doctor's experience. It had become a catalyst for a larger conversation about discrimination in professional spaces, emergency medical care, and the countless barriers that still existed in supposedly elite spaces. 1 week after the incident, Director Morrison sat at the head of a large conference table in the airport's main boardroom. Around her sat representatives from various organizations, the airport board, civil rights leaders, security companies, and medical transport coordinators. The room buzzed with serious discussion. "Let me be clear," Morrison said, tapping a thick report on the table. "What happened to Dr. Mitchell was not an isolated incident. Our investigation has revealed a pattern." She pressed a button, and a screen behind her lit up with statistics. The numbers told a troubling story. Over the past year, there had been 37 reported cases of discriminatory treatment at private aviation terminals across the country. Many more had likely gone unreported. "The good news," Morrison continued, "is that Dr. Mitchell's surgery was successful." A quiet sense of relief filled the room. Young Thomas Parker was recovering well, his family grateful for both the medical care and the public support they had received. In the corner, Lisa Chen, the attorney who had recorded the incident, was taking notes. Her law firm had been hired to oversee the implementation of new security protocols. "We drafted comprehensive guidelines," she announced, passing out documents. Every security company working in private aviation will need to meet these standards. The changes were significant. New training programs would be mandatory. Security staff would wear body cameras at all times. An independent review board would handle complaints. But most importantly, emergency medical personnel would have a new fast-track verification system. Dr. Mitchell's experience has opened our eyes, said John Baker, head of security. We're not just changing rules, we're changing our entire culture. He clicked to the next slide, showing the new security checkpoint design. Multiple cameras, clear signage about rights and responsibilities, and a direct line to supervisors would be standard. Outside the boardroom, the airport was already different. New signs in multiple languages welcomed all travelers. Security guards attended daily briefings about professional conduct. Sandra, the receptionist who had helped Dr. Mitchell, had been promoted to supervisor of customer relations. We're also launching an awareness campaign, Morrison explained, revealing new posters that would soon hang in every terminal. They showed diverse medical professionals, pilots, and business leaders with the message, "Excellence has no bias." The security company that had employed Reynolds had undergone major changes too. Their CEO sat at the table, looking subdued. "We've terminated Mr. Reynolds and reviewed the records of all our employees," he reported. 10% of our staff have been flagged for retraining or dismissal. A representative from the Medical Transport Association spoke next. "We're creating an emergency protocol database," she explained. "Every hospital and charter company will have instant access to verify medical personnel. No more delays for emergency flights." The changes weren't limited to this airport. Other facilities across the country have begun their own reviews. Private aviation companies were updating their policies. Medical transport services were streamlining their verification processes. But perhaps the most important change, Morrison said, pulling up a final slide, is our new reporting system. She demonstrated a simple app that any traveler could use to report problems or discrimination in real time. The reports would go directly to airport administration and an independent oversight committee. In the weeks since the incident, the airport had already received hundreds of messages from people sharing similar experiences. Each story helped shape the new policies. Each voice contributed to the changes being made. Dr. Mitchell's case showed us what was broken, Lisa Chen said, standing to address the room. Now it's our responsibility to fix it. Not just here, but everywhere. The meeting continued for hours as they refined the new protocols. Every detail was examined, from security training materials to emergency response procedures. They were building a new system from the ground up. By the end of the day, Director Morrison had signatures from every organization represented. The changes would take effect immediately. Training would begin the next morning. New equipment was already being installed. As the sun set outside the boardroom windows, Morrison looked at the thick stack of documents they had produced. Real change was happening. It had taken a crisis to spark it, but now there was no going back. "Let's make sure," she said to the room, "that no other Dr. Mitchell ever faces what she faced. Let's make sure that the next time a surgeon rushes to save a life, nothing stands in their way." The representatives nodded in agreement. This wasn't just about fixing one airport's problems. This was about changing an entire system, about making sure excellence was recognized regardless of what it looked like. 3 months after the incident, Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at a podium in a large conference hall. The room was packed with medical professionals, aviation experts, and civil rights advocates. Behind her, a screen showed a smiling photo of Thomas Parker, now fully recovered from this surgery. 3 months ago, Dr. Mitchell began, her voice clear and strong. "I faced discrimination that almost prevented me from reaching a patient in need. Today, I'm here to talk about the changes that incident inspired." In the audience, familiar faces smiled back at her. Sandra from the terminal reception desk was there, now wearing a supervisor's badge. Captain Chen sat with a group of pilots who had formed the Aviation Equality Initiative. Lisa Chen, the attorney, had her laptop open, documenting everything as usual. Thomas Parker made a full recovery. Dr. Mitchell continued, clicking to the next slide. The image showed her with the Parker family, all of them beaming. But his story could have been very different. That's why the changes we've made are so important. She outlined the progress of the past 3 months. 20 major airports had adopted the new security protocols. Emergency medical transport had been revolutionized with a new verification system. Over 500 security staff nationwide had undergone enhanced training. But the most significant change, Dr. Mitchell said, is in people's willingness to speak up. She showed clips of other professionals sharing their stories, inspired by what happened to her. Their voices had led to more improvements, more reforms. In the back of the room, Director Morrison watched with satisfaction. Her airport had become a model for others, with its new policies being copied across the country. The incident that had started as a crisis had transformed into an opportunity for real change. Thomas Parker's parents were in the audience too. Mary Parker stood up to share their story. Dr. Mitchell didn't just save our son's life, she said, wiping away tears. She started a movement that will help countless others. The changes had spread beyond airports. Hospitals had reviewed their emergency transport procedures. Private companies had examined their security practices. Schools were using the incident as a case study in medical ethics and civil rights classes. Dr. Mitchell clicked to her next slide, showing statistics from the new reporting system. In just 3 months, we've handled over 1,000 reports. Each one has helped us identify and fix problems. Each one has made our system better. She shared stories of positive changes. A young black female pilot who flew without harassment, a Hispanic surgeon who reached her emergency patient without delay, an Indian doctor whose credentials were accepted without question. Small victories that added up to big change. The Aviation Equality Initiative, started by Captain Chen and his colleagues, had grown into a national organization. They worked with airports, airlines, and charter companies to ensure fair treatment for all travelers. But our work isn't finished, Dr. Mitchell said, showing her final slide. It was a picture of her medical school graduation, young and full of dreams. Every day, talented professionals face barriers because of how they look. Every day, we need to keep pushing for change. Sandra stood up to share how the terminal had changed. We have a new culture now, she explained. Our staff knows that staying silent is not an option. Everyone is responsible for ensuring fair treatment. Lisa Chen presented data from her firm's ongoing monitoring. The numbers showed clear improvement. Complaints down, response times faster, satisfaction rates higher. Real, measurable progress. The Parker family had started a foundation in Thomas's name, providing scholarships for minority students interested in medicine. We want to help create more Dr. Mitchells, Robert Parker explained. The world needs them. As the conference concluded, Dr. Mitchell looked out at the crowd. She saw determination on every face, commitment in every nod. The incident that had almost derailed her that morning had instead launched a movement for change. 3 months ago, I was just trying to reach a patient, she said in closing. Today, we're all working together to build a better system. A system where excellence is recognized regardless of race. Where emergency care isn't delayed by prejudice. Where speaking up against discrimination is everyone's responsibility. The audience rose in a standing ovation, but Dr. Mitchell's mind was already on her next surgery, her next patient, her next challenge, because that's who she was, a doctor first, focused on saving lives. Now, though, she was also something more, a symbol of change, a catalyst for progress, and proof that one person's stand against discrimination could transform an entire system. As she left the podium, Thomas Parker ran up to give her a hug. The young boy's recovery was all the proof anyone needed. This was what happened when barriers fell away and doctors could simply be doctors, focused on their true mission, saving lives.